everybody. Welcome to the session today, and thanks for coming. So my name is Vicki Moritz-Henry, and I am head of training with Supermums. And it's great to see all of you here today. So how many people in the audience know something about accessibility already? Great. Excellent. I feel like I might be preaching to the choir a little bit today, but hopefully you'll learn a few tips that you'll be able to take away. So to get us started, of course, we have our wonderful forward-looking statement. So don't make any purchasing decisions based on what's said in here today. You'll see this over and over again. It's still the first day, so it might not be stale quite yet. So I'm going to talk to you today about being an accessibility ally, and I wasn't always an accessibility ally myself. I joined Supermums in February of this year as head of training, like I said. And one of my first projects that I came into was a collaboration with a really great nonprofit called Thomas Pocklington Trust. And I'll tell you a little bit about their story and about our collaboration in a moment. But as a part of our takeaways from this project, we came up with a set of tips. So we're going to be talking today about a few of these tips and going through the 5 of them. So to start us off, we need to talk about the story first, because it's an amazing collaboration with a really empowering organization. So Supermums, for those of you who don't know us yet, and you can see my t-shirt with the logo here, we are a workforce development group that helps to empower mums to re-enter the workforce by learning Salesforce skills. So we traditionally do our admin program. We've just expanded out and started with our PD1. We're launching our consulting course and a marketing cloud course as well soon. And we had this admin course. It's completely virtual. So already that's a step in the right direction as far as accessibility goes. But we have a 6-month admin course that has a whole combination of elements. It has mentorship built in, live training with webinars, and a real-life work experience project that our students are working on. And then there's this organization called Thomas Pocklington Trust on the other side. And they are a nonprofit who works to empower the visually impaired into work by providing job support and employability help. So they help them not only to learn how to use a screen reader, but also to find a job and to place them into work as well. So what they decided to do was that they put one of their employees onto our program to test the program for accessibility. And we had Darren Pascal, who came onto our course, and he came on in February of 19. It was my first cohort coming through. And this really became a little bit of a passion project for me coming through. I had just started, I was relatively new as well, in learning about accessibility, learning about how to make the program better for everybody, and making it accessible for somebody who is blind or visually impaired was really something that hit home for me. And Darren came through. He has been in tech for a while. He does a lot of technology testing with Thomas Pocklington Trust. So he had a firm grasp on technology. He had gone to college, but for accessibility reasons, he hadn't been able to graduate before. So he came through our program, and now he is a certified Salesforce administrator, passing his first certification that he was actually able to attain. And as part of it, he gave feedback as well about our course material, so that if there was anything that he couldn't access, that he had trouble with, we could fix it, and we could make it better for other people coming in and doing the program as well. So some of you might be saying, it's looked like for the most part, everybody's relatively familiar with accessibility already, but for those of you who aren't, a screen reader is a very important tool when it comes to accessibility. And that's another thing, I wasn't sure what a screen reader was when I came on even. I was rather ignorant myself. And a screen reader is a tool that basically reads the screen on your computer for you, and it will read all of the text, all of the images as well, and be reading through and allowing you to access websites, whether it's documents, basically anything that's on your computer, it's going to help you access it. And there's a few different options that we went through, and I've shared them all with you here today as well. So there's JAWS, that is one option. That is a paid version. So many times if somebody's using JAWS, it may be sponsored by a program coming through or something like that. NVDA is a great one. It's a free one. Unfortunately, it does not work on a Mac, as I found out the hard way. And then there are a few others as well. There's Window Eyes, there is Dolphin Supernova, System Access, and Zoom Text. And all of them work slightly differently. So when we were going through and doing our pilot, Darren would test on all of them to see which one would work better. For example, Zoom Text, it zooms in on something on the screen and magnifies that. So it reads it in a slightly different way. And a lot of times from what I found out, people who are using screen readers, they have a preference for one or the other. You kind of find your favorite tool and go back and forth maybe between one or two. It's kind of like your favorite browser as well. So out of this collaboration, he finished the course in July. And since then, we've been thinking about how could we get this information out there. We've learned so much, and we've gone through, and we've done all this amazing feedback and gathered all of this information, but how can we get it out there? How can we share it? And that's where we put in a submission for Dreamforce, and it actually came through, which was really cool. So I'm happy to be here today sharing some of the top 5 tips on how to become an accessibility ally and build it into your org and your training. So my tip number 1 is narrate your demos. I'm a trainer, so I come from a teaching background. I like teaching, I like sharing knowledge. And this is one that kind of caught me off guard because when I was going through, you get used to training in a certain way, and you don't necessarily think about, well, what if the person on the other side of the computer has trouble maybe seeing contrast or seeing the screen is using a screen reader? And this was a really impressive one for me as well.
Hi everybody, today we're going to learn how to get our org ID number. So first we're going to click over here and we'll go into our setup menu. So once we are in setup, we just click over here and type in company or company information. We'll go down here and just scroll down here. And voila, here it is, our Salesforce.com organization ID. So that is how you find your Salesforce.com organization ID.
So that was a demo on a relatively easy thing that all of us probably have done if you've worked on the Salesforce side. If you're an admin, a dev, you know how to get to the org ID. And it's one of the first things that you learn as an admin coming through when you're working on a project. You need to know your org ID for various reasons. And there in that demo, you saw it without narration. So what were some of the things that were missing? That's what we're going to see in the next one with narration, and I'm going to let you take a listen and just be thinking about what the difference is between the two and how they're presented, because they're presenting the exact same information, but just differently.
Hi everybody, today we're going to be learning how to find our org ID. So we start in the front end of Salesforce and we're going to be going into setup. So that is by clicking on our gear icon, which is the 4th icon in on the upper right hand side. We'll click into the drop down menu that brings us to setup. And setup will bring us to the back end. So this is where we're going to be spending a lot of time as administrators. We click into the quick find box, which is on the left-hand side. And this is where we're going to be spending a lot of our time as admins. So we type in company, and it will bring in company information. We'll click into company information and scroll down on this page. On the lower right-hand side, there is our Salesforce.com organization ID listed here. So right next to it, we can see our unique org ID. It's 00D2P501410OT. So it's a mixture of uppercase and lowercase, and that would be your Salesforce.com organization ID.
So that was the second demo, and it was showing the exact same thing. It's showing where to go on the backside in setup to find your org ID. So can anybody see a couple of the difference? Maybe shout them out. You can come up to the microphone as well. Yeah?
You didn't say the word click over here at all in the
Mm-hmm. You've got it. That is a really important one. So it's about narrating your demos. If you're saying click over here, it's a habit that all of us have. We say, okay, well, you're going to click over here on this side. We might say on the left side or the right side, but we're not really specific about where we're clicking. And when you're working with somebody who can't see what you're doing, who is using a screen reader or relying on an audio and what you're saying to follow along with your demo, they're instantly getting lost at that point. So you have to make sure that you're narrating your demo, that you're saying, well, click in the upper left-hand corner. And another thing that is tied in with that as well is that with screen readers, a lot of times you can save a favorite spot on this page. So you can be saying, okay, well, this is a spot that I use a lot, and you can be making basically a hotkey that goes to that spot each time. So another thing that I said in there around clicking over here is that we're clicking into the quick find box, for example. This is an area where we're going to be spending a lot of time. And by saying that, somebody who is using a screen reader is going to say, okay, well, a light bulb turned on. I need to bookmark this. I'm going to be spending a lot of time there, and that way it's preventing from having to tab through the entire screen or the entire page to get to where they want to go. So it's a very subtle tool, and it's one that if you're listening to a demo or a narration, you might not even hear it, but for a person who is using a screen reader, it's absolutely essential. And was there anything else that anybody noticed as well?
There's a lot more specifics on describing the settings and the gear icon visually and like as well as what
Exactly, because when somebody is using a screen reader, the individual may have different levels of sight. So if somebody is just having trouble with contrast and maybe relying on the screen reader tool slightly, instead of somebody who's completely relying on it, by saying the shape of the object, then you're letting that person know what it looks like, and they can look for that contrast as well, and that can be helping them. And was there anything else? Yeah?
Yeah, I noticed you gave the third tab over from the right.
Yes, counting. Yes, because a screen reader, it's using the tab to go through fairly often. And we'll talk about using the tab to test as an admin or a dev a little bit later. But from a narrate your demo side, it's very important to say where you're going and any sort of guidance that you can give that's extra. Saying, okay, well, you need to click 3 times, then that's going to help somebody to be following along. Were there any last ones? Also, reading anything. So instead of saying just this is your org ID, if you're going through and reading it, which I kind of stumbled at one point there, but you're reading it out loud, that's enabling the person who's listening to your demo to make sure that they're in the right place. You're giving them something to check off of. And basically giving the right answer at the end so that they make sure that they're lined up with the right field that you're looking at. So that is why it is so important to narrate your demos, and you guys did a great job on picking up on some of those as well. And it really is a habit to get in the habit of, basically. It's something that is unnatural, and you have to always be catching yourself at first. But once you start doing it a couple times, it just becomes built into your training. And it's not only going to help somebody who has accessibility issues or who's using a screen reader, it's going to help everybody who's following along. So if there is a mom who's listening to your training and maybe has her baby in the background and looked away from the computer for a moment, she can still be following along with the voice. So it's really going to help everybody and improve your training in general. The next tip is about adding alt text to your documentation. So has anybody used alt text here before? Great. So so out of the people who have used it, who has used it for accessibility reasons? Okay, great. That is wonderful. I was just on training where it was being used for another reason, and they had actually never heard of it being used for accessibility. So there are a few different uses of alt text, but alt text, for those of you who haven't heard about it before, who may not have used it, it's short for alternative text. And it's a text that's added to an image, and you're able to provide a description to that image. And most programs are great. They're going to go through and be using AI, which we're all familiar here with AI, or trying to guess what the image may be. But programs like Microsoft, or like PowerPoint, like Windows, or like Word, they're not going to be able to identify what the picture is really saying. They might say screenshot, but they're not going to be able to explain what is in the screenshot, why you put it there. So by using alt text, you're adding a description to the image, and you're basically telling the screen reader what it should be reading, and that description should be of why that image is there. Why is it there in the first place? Why is this useful? What is this image trying to tell me? So it's very useful for it to have the word screenshot in it, for example, because then you're telling the person, okay, this is a screenshot, and then what is it of? So to add alt text, you go into the document, and usually you right-click on it, and you'll have the option to add alt text. Another thing you can do from the alt text box is to mark an image as descriptive. And then the screen reader is going to jump over it. So it's going to say, well, this isn't really important, so I'm going to go to the next thing right away. And that's really useful as well because you're not getting caught up in things that aren't pertinent, and you're really able to focus in on the important information. Another thing that I always like to point out with the alt text tool is that I know on Word at least, it says best practice 2 to 3 sentences. I'd say that's not the case for most, especially if you're doing training or documentation around Salesforce. You may need more than 2 to 4 sentences to get your point across. So go ahead and make it as long as you need it to be. You don't want it to be extraneous, but you need to get your point across. So you do want to make it as concise as possible, but I've had some that are 5, 6 sentences long, and as long as that information is useful and pertinent, it is absolutely fine in your training as well. Another bonus tip that we found out that we were actually pretty excited about and maybe a little bit overzealous about is that when you're doing alt text, you can also be linking your alt text to a URL. And that way, if your image that you're using is too descriptive, it's hard to describe it, you would be doing a lot of extra work to add in a description there. For example, if it's coming from a website like Salesforce's help documents or Trailhead that already has accessibility built into it, you can be pointing the screen reader to that page, and by putting the URL in, the person will be prompted to go to that URL and view that image, that chart, that document, or whatever it is on the original website so that you don't have to duplicate work that's already done. And that was a real time saver for us and kind of a game changer. It sounds really simple, but when we found out that it actually worked and tested it, then it was a lot of fun to play around with. And like I said, Salesforce is great around accessibility. We had no issues with any Salesforce help document, any trailheads, so any sort of documentation like that that you can use to your benefit and that you can already have that accessibility built in is a big help. So my third tip is around formatting. So as Salesforce admins, as Salesforce developers, a lot of times we're thinking about the user interface at the end of the day, or the user experience, and we're thinking about how we want it to be looking to front-end users. So when you're formatting a document especially, our next tip will get into the page layouts, but this one is more about the documentation and any training material that you may be developing. This may seem like common sense, but don't overuse the styling. When a screen reader is going through and reading this text, it is going to stop at the beginning of each text formatting change, and it's going to be saying the font size, or the type of font, the styling that changed, the color that changed, and that's very disruptive when somebody is going through. Imagine going through a help documentation and just being constantly interrupted with the color of the font changing. So that would be very difficult to go through. So best practice is don't overuse the styling, don't keep changing it up, and avoid extra images if possible. It's great having Cody, Astro, and I at World Tour in London, but it's not really necessary for our documentation here. It's not really necessary for the presentation. So avoid extra images or mark them as decorative if you are going to put them in if they're not absolutely necessary. And another thing that you can do when you're working with documentation is to use the built-in styling tools that are in there. So if you're using Word, there's things like headings and subheadings that you can be using for your documentation rather than just recreating that feel, which many of us probably do. I was guilty of it before as well. And by using a header, you're making it easier for the screen reader to navigate and jump around. So when you're reading through it the first time, it doesn't really change that much. But if somebody's going back into your documentation, as often users are, then they are able to navigate and say, okay, well, remember this was in the third section, and they can use the screen reader to navigate down to the third header and then be looking for whatever information they're searching for in there. So it's really helpful to use all of those built-in tools. There's a lot built in around accessibility that we're not even necessarily aware of until somebody points us out to it, and that was the case for me. So my third tip is about, this is the second part of the third tip. So keep your formatting clean and minimalistic. So we saw what we shouldn't do here, but do keep it clean. Do keep the contrast high as well. The best contrast to have is a 4 to 5 to 1 ratio, and that's just best practice for anybody doing any sort of design. And that is so that if somebody does have partial sight and is able to see part of the screen, having that high contrast level is going to make it easier for something to stand out and read. And really, again, it's just best practice, because for anybody who's looking at a document, if you have orange text on top of a purple background, it's really difficult to read what's said there. But if you have black on white, which is the classic, then it stands out, it's easy to read, it's easy to focus on. So do make regular use of the headers, stub headers, and make sure that the images are pertinent. So my step number 4 is around page layouts. And the page layout tool, as far as learning administrator skills, as somebody who is visually impaired, this was the only tool that we really had trouble with. Because the screen reader is going to see the page layouts in Salesforce. You will all probably know that nice box that opens up, and you drag and drop your fields, you move them around. Well, a screen reader sees that all as blank. It doesn't see anything there. It sees it as a big blank box, and you're not able to drag and drop anything. So there are some tools that we have tried, like that zoom one, and you can kind of guess where something is and where it should be, but it's very hit and miss. So that is the only functionality in Salesforce that we did have a little bit of issues with. And that is also what drives many people who are using screen readers as administrators to become developers, because you can use Visualforce and be deciding where you want your fields to be on the screen and reordering them that way as well. But also, from an admin side, for your end users who are using a screen reader, there are quite a few things that you can do to help make it more accessible as well. And once again, these are going to go back to many best practices that were already things that, going through them, we think, oh, I should have been doing this already, but maybe I wasn't. So when you're creating a page layout and how to make it accessible, place the most commonly used fields at the top. Because a screen reader is tabbing through each field, then by having the most commonly used fields, or even the most commonly used components in general, towards the top of a page, that's going to make it easier for people to get to and easier for the screen reader to be able to access it. So you want to think about navigation. Also, group related fields into expandable sections. This comes back to the idea of headers with documentation. By having those expandable sections, you're able to, like it says, expand them. You're able to expand, you're also able to make them smaller so that you can navigate easier. So by splitting things into sections, you're making it easier to navigate, easier to find the fields that you're looking for. Another tip for you is also to choose the tab order. So when you're creating each section within your page layout, you're actually able to decide what tab order you'd like it to be, whether you want it to read horizontally or whether you want it to read vertically. And that's going to decide where the screen reader is going to read across and what order the fields will show up in. So you can make it something that's intuitive, that's going to be useful for the end user as well. And place the components as well intuitively on the page. So if you are using knowledge articles a lot, you may put your knowledge article component towards the top, and something like related links or related articles, you can put that towards the bottom if it's something that's not used quite as commonly. So once again, making it easier to navigate to and making it easier to access. And my tip number 5 is a relatively long one. It's about testing for accessibility. So all of us in the Salesforce world probably know that when you're doing anything, you have to test. We are constantly testing. We're testing as we go through phases. We're testing before rollouts. We're always testing what we've done to make sure that it's working. And there's a couple different ways that you can test for accessibility as well. So how many people in the room are admins? Okay, good. And how many people are devs? Great, so we have a couple devs in here as well. So there are 2 different types of testing that you can do. I am an admin myself. I will admit I'm not a developer at all. So writing code, it's a little bit above my head still. Maybe one day we'll get there, but not quite yet. So there is different code that you can write into different code snippets that you can write into your code. And Salesforce has some of those built in directly as well. So you can use a built-in Salesforce testing functionality to automatically write accessibility tests into your code and just have that be part of your process going through as well. And otherwise, you can use open source testing resources such as Axe and Linters. And there are a few others as well. So Salesforce does integrate very nicely with them, and you can use those open source codes as well. And at the end, I have a few Trailhead modules that will be able to explain the whole dev side much better than I can. So I can just point you in the right direction if that's something that you're interested in for those of you who are devs in the audience. For those of you who are admins, that doesn't mean that just because there's all of this code and testing that you're not concerned, that you can't do accessibility testing, because you absolutely can. You can test manually. So as I mentioned, the screen reader, it uses different controls on the keyboard to navigate through the information, to navigate through the fields from one image to another, from one component to another. And you can turn that on your computer by enabling keyboard navigation. And by doing that, you're allowing your computer to mimic the way that a screen reader is going to interact with your training, with your org. And you're able to test to make sure that you are able to get from one element to another. So I included a few different of the commands that you can use. For example, tab, it navigates to the next focusable element. So as long as the screen reader is able to focus on it and able to see it, then it will navigate to it. So a tab is a really good way to do some basic testing and just tab through the items, tab through the components, make sure that it's working the way that you want it to, make sure that the order is correct, that everything is able to be accessed through the tab key. And then there's a few different ones on here as well. For example, enter activates a link or button or submits a form. So just make sure that all of your buttons are working, all of your URLs, and you can be testing all of this as you're going through. So I'm not going to bore you by reading through all of these, but you'll have access to these slides later as well. And then that brings us to a nice test checklist as well. So I will not claim credit for this. This comes from Salesforce help documentation, and it is out there for the general public. But it's a really great checklist, and I found this really useful to just have something that you're going through and ticking off a list as you're testing your accessibility at the end of a project before you're rolling it out for end users. So the first one is, can you reach every interactive element? So if something is there on your page, you should be able to access it. So make sure that you can tab through. Make sure you can be going from one spot to another and moving around the page correctly. And not only can you get there, but can you activate it? If it's something that's supposed to be activated, if it is a video component that's playing, make sure that you can play the video. That by pressing, not only tabbing to it, it gets it in focus, but you have to make sure that when you press enter, that that video actually runs or that that link actually opens. So it's an extra layer on top of the first point. Can you focus on elements that aren't interactive? So something that you're just supposed to read through. Maybe you have a component that has helpful tips that are on there, and it's just maybe a rich text component that you've put onto your page to help give extra guidance to a sales user, whoever it is that's using your org. Make sure that that is available as well, and that you can navigate and that you can read through all of that as well, that it's reading the text back to you. Number 4 is going to be, can you always visually tell where you are on the page? So make sure that it is intuitive. Can you tell where you are? Can you navigate in an intuitive way? Number 5, does your focus move appropriately when you take action? Does your focus ever move when you don't take action? So make sure that it's not just clicking around the screen in any order, in the namby-pamby. So you want to make sure that it's going in the right place, that it's doing exactly what you want to do, only when you tell it to do that. You don't want it to be doing extra stuff on the side. Number 6 is, do hover tools also appear on focus? So any sort of help text that you add in, you may have help text on a field that you've added in, and that's there for a reason. You want your end user to be able to access that and to be able to read it. So make sure that any sort of hover text, especially if you're developing custom components or something like that, you want to make sure that any hoverable material that you've added in is accessible, and that's not necessarily easy for those of you who are developers in the crowd. You probably know. And the last one is, do any drag and drop features have keyboard support? So like I said, the page layout, the component for that, it's not intuitive. It doesn't allow you to tab through and to drag something from one area to another. However, a multi-select field, a multi-select pick list, that is going to allow you to do it, because you can hold the control button and be selecting multiple choices and then tabbing them over to the other side. So you want to make sure that any components, especially if it's something custom that you're building, that you're checking to make sure that they don't only work by clicking on the mouse and dragging a box from one side to the other, but that you're also able to do that with your keyboard. It's really great for your users as well. If their mouse ever dies or anything like that, they'll be happy and appreciate it, as well as anybody who is using a screen reader. So that's an excellent checklist that I just like to have printed out on my desk and kind of have it around handy, especially when I'm going through and doing any training or setting anything up. And this is a summary slide. So it's around the different steps. So 1, narrate your demo. 2, add alt text to your documentation. 3, format with accessibility in mind. Step 4 is make your page layouts intuitive. Step 5 is test for accessibility. And then step 6 is always the most important to me. It's be an accessibility ally, and it's all about spreading the word as well. So it is great to come to a lecture like this or a presentation and be learning about what you can do to make your org and make your documentation accessible, to allow somebody who's using a screen reader to have an easier time understanding it. But it's also important to bring that back and to spread the word. You want to take this away with you, take it back to your company, take it back to your organization, and be talking about it. I know I get really excited when I'm talking about accessibility, which is why, for me, coming here and speaking to all of you today was just an amazing opportunity for me and for our organizations, both of them, to be able to have this continuation of our discussion and be not only keeping this information for ourselves, which seems a little bit selfish at the end of the day, but also to be sharing it with everybody else. So it would be great if everybody in this room can go away and just talk to one other person about it, or talk to your team about it, and be sharing about how to build accessibility, and just get everybody in the habit of doing it. And by that doing so, we're going to be able to spread the word, and we're going to be able to make everything accessible. And that's really what it's all about. So as I mentioned before, I do have a couple trailheads here, a couple trailhead modules, sorry, that are really useful on accessibility. There's accessibility basics, so for anybody who is an admin, this is an excellent one to start with. It goes through what is accessibility and what are some of the different tools, and goes into a little bit more explanation than I did today. And then there's also some that are more coding related, but I enjoyed doing them as well as an admin. So there are some things that went over my head. There's a few things of coding that I just copied and pasted, not really understanding what I was doing, but just kind of nodding and following along and being happy when the challenge passed. But otherwise, designing for web accessibility, coding for web accessibility, and testing for web accessibility, there is information in there that's really useful, really informative, and I'd advise that everybody here today go and take a look at them, no matter what level you're at, and learn about the different ways that you can be an ally, that you can be spreading the word, and doing all of this yourself as well. So I'd like to thank you all for coming to the presentation today and for your interest in being an accessibility ally. And at this point, I'd like to open it up for any questions. So we do have a microphone at the front if anybody wants to come up or has any questions about it. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, so for those in the back who might not have heard, the question was about mobile devices, which is a really good one, and whether the same structure, the same key reader, screen reader, sorry, that's the end of the speech, the screen reader still is applicable to mobile devices, and the answer is yes. There are different screen reader devices that are mobile accessible, and I would suggest going to Thomas Pocklington's website. They have a really good set of YouTube videos that they went through and talked about mobile accessibility specifically, not necessarily Salesforce related, but what does it look like to have a mobile screen reader and how can you do different testing around that. So it looks a little bit different. It's not going to be the whole keyboard functionality, but you can still do testing to make sure that it works or even be installing the screen reader on your phone to test and make sure that everything is functioning the right way. And any other questions, too? Great. Well, it looks like that was everybody. That means I covered pretty much everything then, hopefully, or hopefully it's not that anybody's too shy, but if you are, feel free to come up and chat with me after the session, and otherwise enjoy the rest of your Dreamforce as well.